All right, lesson 4.4 is using congruent triangles. Our objectives are to use triangle congruence and CPCTC to prove that parts of two triangles are congruent. So before we were proving that triangles are congruent, now we're saying, hey, these are congruent, so what else matches in that triangle? So CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So before we tried to use the fact that we knew parts were congruent to prove that the triangles were congruent, now we're saying, hey, we know these triangles are congruent, so their corresponding parts then we can also say are congruent. So let's look at example 1. Example 1's congruent statements. The diagram shows that the frame of an umbrella. What congruent statements besides angle 3 is congruent to angle 4 can you prove from the diagram in which SL is congruent to SR, so this side over here is congruent to this side. Angle 3 and angle 4 is what they've already given to us. And angle 1 and 2 are given. So we know that these two, angles 1 and angle 2, are congruent. So SC, that's this side in the middle, is congruent to side SC by the reflexive property of congruence. And triangle LSC is congruent to RSC by, and we have to decide. We've got a side, an angle, and another side. So I'm going to say the SAS postulate. So then we're proving that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4 because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So all we proved was angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. So then when two triangles are congruent, you can form congruent statements about 3 pairs of corresponding angles and 3 pairs of corresponding sides. We're going to list the congruence statements. So first we have SC was congruent to SC. That was by the reflexive property of congruence. And they gave us SL is congruent to SR because that was the given statement. Then, because we proved those triangles are congruent, we didn't say anything about side CL before, but we know that it's congruent to side CR because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, then they gave us angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. We proved 3 was congruent to angle 4 by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Then we also have this angle here, CLS and CRS. Those angles are also congruent because we proved the triangles are congruent. So angle CLS is congruent to angle CRS by the same CPCTC. So then from that diagram, what congruent statements that remain to be proved? So we've got angle 5 down here and angle 6. So we haven't proven anything about angles 5 and angle 6. Everything else in that triangle, in those two triangles, we proved. So let's keep going with this. 2. Using right triangles. According to the legend, one of Napoleon's followers used congruent triangles to estimate the width of a river. On a riverbank, the officer stood up straight and lowered the visor of his cap until the farthest thing he could see was the edge of the opposite bank. Then he turned and noted the spot on his side of the river that was in line with his eye over in the tip of his visor. So he looks at one side of the river, makes the height of his cap match the end of the river, then he turns his head to his side of the bank and marks that spot. Okay, so they give you this little diagram of this guy on the river. Given that angle DEG is congruent to angle DEF, okay, DEG and DEF are right angles, so right here those are right angles. Then we know the angle EDG is congruent to angle EDF. The officer paced off the distance to the spot and declared that the distance to be the width of the river. The given states that DEG and DEF are right angles. So what conditions must hold for that to be true? So if these are going to be right angles that the officer makes with the ground, the officer must stand perpendicular to the ground, right, to form a 90-degree angle. And the ground must be flat, because if it's not flat, then it doesn't make a 90-degree angle. Okay, so that was just kind of applying the triangles to a real-life situation. So what I need you to do now are the check for understanding problems. There's only these 2 questions. Number 1 has 2 parts. Number 1, in example 1, what can you say about angle 5 and 6? So earlier we said, hey, we didn't say anything about a congruent statement for these 2. What can we say now, knowing all this other information up top? Then it says, when the fabric is stretched by the umbrella frame, do the triangles remain congruent? Yes, no, explain why. And then number 2, we're just going to look at example 2. We're going to say this distance he paced off is 20 paces. If each pace is 2.5 feet long, how long is the river, or how wide is the river? So you just got to multiply there and get your answer. All right, go ahead and get started on those. Check your answers with me. If you have any questions, let me know, and good luck.